Imagine the flicker of oil lamps casting long, trembling shadows on the cool limestone walls of the embalming chamber. The scent of resin, incense, and freshly ground natron clings to the air. You've been a royal embalmer your entire life, trained to follow the sacred rites of mummification with unwavering precision. Every gesture, every incision, every wrapping is dictated by centuries of holy tradition. But today, your hands shake. Before you lies the pharaoh's wife, her skin pale as moonlight under the cold glow of the chamber. She is beautiful, even in death, a beauty now guarded by the stillness of eternity. But this is no ordinary burial. The order you've been given is unlike anything you've heard whispered, even in the darkest corners of temple gossip. You are to preserve her in a way that violates the very foundation of the funerary code, a method spoken of only in hushed tones, its purpose hidden behind a veil of divine secrecy. And the reason for this defiance of sacred law makes your blood run cold. This is not fiction. In the Egypt of the ancients, such commands were not impossible. They were a daily reality in a civilization where sexuality was not merely personal, not merely pleasure, but a divine force woven into the survival of the state. To modern minds, these practices might seem like nightmares, yet to the ancient Egyptians, they were as natural and necessary as the annual flooding of the Nile. We all think we know ancient Egypt, the golden masks, the towering pyramids, the serene statues of pharaohs gazing across millennia. That is the Egypt polished for schoolbooks and museum halls. But beneath the gold leaf and carved stone lay a far darker truth. This was a civilization where sexual acts were not merely tolerated in sacred spaces, they were commanded. Where elite children were shaped into offerings for the gods in ways that would horrify even the most liberal of societies today, and where festivals under the guise of holy devotion dissolved into chaos so complete that even foreign emissaries feared for their lives. For more than 100 years, much of this history was deliberately hidden. Victorian archaeologists, whose sensibilities were shaped by an age of moral rigidity, locked away artifacts, burned papyri, and erased images from walls rather than allow the public to see what they had found. They weren't protecting ancient secrets, they were protecting their own reputations, unable to reconcile their idea of Egypt's grandeur with the unsettling realities buried in its sands. From 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, this culture of cosmic sexuality thrived. It was not simply indulgence, it was governance. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a living god whose virility was believed to control the very forces of nature, fertility of the fields, the flooding of the Nile, the birth rate of the people. The pressure to perform, to embody divine potency, was immense. Rituals increasingly extreme were crafted to display that potency to the gods and to the nation. Evidence of these practices still exists, but not in the public eye. Inscriptions on temple walls rarely shown to tourists. Fragments of papyri sealed in climate-controlled archives containing details too explicit for polite exhibitions. Archaeological finds unearthed in the 19th century that never saw the light of day because their discoverers feared they would scandalize Europe. The Egyptian worldview was built on a simple but potent idea. Sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy was an act of creation, echoing the gods' own acts at the dawn of time. To touch another was to engage in a kind of prayer. To climax was to speak with the divine, and every position, every caress had symbolic weight in the sacred balance between order and chaos. But there was a darkness at the heart of this cosmic devotion. In this system, bodies, especially the bodies of the young, the enslaved, and the powerless, were not seen as belonging to themselves. They were vessels for the gods, property of the temples, instruments for the state. When the Nile failed to flood, when harvests faltered, when plagues struck, the rituals intensified. Desperation led to acts that blurred the line between worship and cruelty until it vanished altogether. And then, in 1925, in the quiet sterility of a laboratory far from the Nile, came the discovery that would shake Egyptology to its core. Howard Carter's team was examining the mummy of the boy king Tutankhamun in unprecedented detail when they noticed something that did not fit any known burial tradition. His genitals were gone. Not lost to decay, not broken by the passage of time, but removed with the precision of a surgeon's hand. The cuts were clean, deliberate, and recent relative to his death. This was no accident. It was a message carved into the body of a god king. And Tutankhamun was not the only one. The shock of Tutankhamun's missing genitals was not an isolated curiosity. It was the opening crack in a sealed vault of truths the modern world had been spared for centuries. As scholars pored over other royal mummies, the pattern became undeniable. Some kings had been entirely castrated. Others showed signs of surgical enhancement, where foreign materials had been inserted post-mortem. These were not crude mutilations, but deliberate, skilled procedures, carried out by hands trained as much in sacred symbolism as in anatomy. To the ancient Egyptians, sexuality was never confined to the private chamber. It was a current of divine force that flowed through their politics, religion, and even their understanding of the cosmos. In their mythology, the world was birthed from acts of creation that were sexual at their very core. The god Atum bringing the first life into existence through an act of self-pleasure. The goddess Isis using her own body to restore Osiris to life long enough to conceive Horus. These were not just stories, they were templates for human behavior, rituals to be reenacted to maintain the balance of the world. Every act of intimacy was a mirror of the gods' acts, and thus a prayer in motion. An orgasm was not just a release, it was a channel through which mortal bodies could commune with the divine. In this worldview, every gesture, every position, every coupling carried cosmic significance. To deny the body's desires was to risk breaking the chain between the human and the divine. For the pharaoh, this belief was both a blessing and a curse. As a living god, his potency was believed to sustain Egypt itself. If the Nile failed to flood, if crops withered, if plagues swept the land, the people would not look to the sky, they would look to the royal bedchamber. Failure in the pharaoh's intimate duties could be seen as failure to maintain Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. This divine burden trickled down through the elite. Nobles and high priests were expected to mirror the king's potency in their own households and in temple ceremonies. Fertility rituals became elaborate displays of sexual vigor, often held in public spaces or within temple precincts where sacred statues loomed as silent witnesses. Every act, no matter how extreme, could be justified if it was framed as an offering to the gods. But this reverence for sexual energy had a shadow. It created a culture where the boundaries between personal will and sacred obligation dissolved entirely. Children born into noble families were often pledged to the temple before they could even speak. Slaves, especially the young and unblemished, were absorbed into the same system, their bodies transformed into tools for rituals in which refusal was unthinkable. For those at the bottom of Egypt's hierarchy, the divine language of sexuality became a weapon of control. A master could claim that any act was demanded by the gods. A priest could declare that the survival of the realm required it. And in a land where the gods were not distant deities, but living presences embodied in the ruling class, such declarations were absolute. The archaeological record supports this reality, though much of it has been hidden. Fragments of papyri in private collections describe rites too explicit to publish in the prudish climate of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Tomb murals, scrubbed clean or covered with plaster, once depicted acts we now would not associate with religion. And in the sealed storerooms of the great museums of the world lie statues, amulets, and carvings that depict without shame what official history prefers to forget. What emerges from the scraps we are allowed to see is a civilization where intimacy was not about choice, romance, or personal connection. It was about cosmic balance and political dominance. It was about the pharaoh standing as the axis between heaven and earth, proving his power not only in battle, but in the bed. It was about temples that pulsed with the belief that human bodies, properly used, could feed the gods themselves. And it was about a darkness so deeply woven into the sacred that for many there was no difference between worship and submission.
It began in silence, under the pale glow of electric lamps strung haphazardly in a cramped laboratory in Cairo, 1925. Howard Carter, the man who had cracked open the sealed door to Tutankhamun's tomb just 3 years earlier, now stood before the unwrapped body of the boy king. The room was heavy with the smell of ancient resin and the faint metallic tang of embalming salts. Technicians leaned over the fragile form, their scalpels and tweezers glinting in the light. What they saw that day was not something that could be catalogued on a neat line in an excavation report. Tutankhamun's body was astonishingly well preserved in many respects. The skin, charred black by an unusual chemical reaction, clung tightly to the bones. The linen wrappings still bore traces of perfume. But when Carter's team examined the lower abdomen, they froze. The boy king's genitals were gone. Not shriveled by decay, not broken off through the centuries, but absent, as if they had never existed. And where they should have been, there were clean surgical cuts through mummified tissue, precise as the work of a skilled physician. This was no damage of time, it was deliberate. At first, the team hesitated to speak of it, fearing scandal, ridicule, and the outrage of the Egyptian authorities. But the more they examined, the stranger it became. The incision marks suggested the removal had occurred shortly after death, during the embalming itself. There was no attempt to disguise or replace what was missing, an omission unthinkable in a culture that treated bodily wholeness as essential for the afterlife. Unless, of course, the mutilation was itself the ritual. Tutankhamun's notes, later published only in fragments, hinted at his unease. He knew the symbolism of sexual organs in Egyptian religion. They were not mere flesh, but emblems of fertility, continuity, and divine potency. For a king to be deprived of them could mean a deliberate erasure of power in the next life, or, conversely, a transformation into a more perfect spiritual form by removing what priests considered flawed. The enigma deepened as other royal mummies underwent closer examination in the decades that followed. The body of Ramesses V bore similar signs. An unnamed noble from the 19th dynasty appeared to have undergone not removal, but post-mortem enhancement, with foreign material inserted to artificially enlarge what had withered in death. These were not acts of desecration by enemies. They were carried out with the care of an embalmer's trained hands. But the most unsettling revelation came when the remains of an 18th dynasty prince were brought to light. He was young, perhaps no older than 16, and the evidence was unmistakable. The removal of his genitals had been performed while he was still alive. Bone and tissue analysis revealed trauma patterns consistent with a procedure carried out on the living, pain so severe it would have been unendurable without restraint. This was no punishment in the sense we might imagine. The condition of the body and the lavishness of the tomb indicated honor, not disgrace, which meant the suffering had been framed as sacrifice, an offering of one's very identity to the gods. Ancient funerary texts began to take on new meaning in light of these finds. Passages about perfecting the form for eternity and removing imperfection before the final journey could now be read in a chillingly literal sense. Yet for all their significance, these discoveries were kept quiet. Victorian and Edwardian sensibilities could not stomach the idea of such brutality wrapped in the robes of religion. Reports were edited, photographs destroyed, and objects quietly moved into the locked archives of museums. The public was shown only the splendor, the gold mask, the chariots, the jewelry. The truth of what those treasures had accompanied into the tomb was left buried under layers of silence. But this was only the first thread in a much larger tapestry, a system of sexual and ritual control that reached from the pharaoh's throne to the smallest slave hut along the Nile. The mutilated kings were not isolated victims. They were the pinnacle of a hierarchy in which every body had a place, and that place was determined by how it could serve the cosmic order.
The tomb was small compared to the grand resting places of pharaohs, but its walls gleamed with careful decoration, scenes of a youth hunting birds along the marsh, offering flowers to the gods, and receiving gifts from elders. The 18th dynasty prince whose body lay inside was clearly loved, cherished enough to be buried with fine linen wrappings, perfumed unguents, and amulets of protection. Yet when his remains were examined, a horror emerged that no amount of artistry could conceal. His genitals were missing, but unlike the post-mortem removals seen in other royals, here the bones and soft tissue told a more agonizing story. Microscopic analysis revealed signs of hemorrhage and inflammation that could only have occurred while the heart was still beating. The edges of the wound bore patterns consistent with sharp copper or obsidian blades, wielded with precision but without mercy. In other words, the mutilation had been performed while he was alive. Why? The answer, at least to his society, lay not in cruelty for cruelty's sake, but in the highest form of religious devotion. Ancient Egyptian belief prized the concept of nefer, perfection, beauty, completeness. To be prepared for eternity, the body had to be shaped into its most divine form, and for reasons still debated by scholars, this sometimes meant alterations so severe that by our standards, it was mutilation. Some texts from temple libraries speak of removing the mortal weakness to make the eternal strong. In one papyrus, an unnamed high priest instructs embalmers to cut away the shadow of man so he may rise as the light of God. Such language, once interpreted metaphorically, now bore chilling literal implications in light of the prince's fate. The procedure may have been intended as a transformative rite, granting the deceased a purer spiritual identity in the afterlife. There are hints, scattered in myth and inscription, that in certain cults, male sexual organs were considered symbolic of earthly desire, binding the soul to mortal needs. Removing them was thought to free the spirit from temptation, allowing it to serve the gods eternally without distraction. But while these ideas could explain post-mortem alteration, they do not soften the brutality of performing the act on the living.
The fact that the prince was richly buried suggests his suffering was sanctified, not hidden. His pain would have been framed as sacrifice, a willing or perhaps coerced offering to secure divine favor for his family, his people, or even the kingdom itself. Such acts also carried a political dimension. By undergoing a ritual that rendered him incapable of fathering heirs, the prince could never threaten the royal succession. In this way, the boundaries between religion and politics dissolved entirely. What was called divine perfection could also be ruthless dynastic control. And here lay the true complexity of Egyptian cosmic sexuality. It was never solely about devotion, nor solely about dominance. It was both at once, woven so tightly together that even those who suffered under it may have believed they were honored. Victorian archaeologists who encountered such evidence recoiled. The idea that a sophisticated, mathematically brilliant, artistically gifted civilization could also practice such extreme rites clashed with their romanticized vision of Egypt as the cradle of refined culture. Many of these finds were quietly sealed away. Some mummies were rewrapped, their more disturbing features concealed, and returned to their coffins without full study. Reports that did circulate spoke vaguely of damage or missing parts, erasing the ritual significance. The mutilated prince, then, is not merely a historical curiosity. He is a key to understanding the entire machinery of control that defined intimate life in ancient Egypt. A machinery that placed the pharaoh at its shining apex and the most vulnerable at its unlit depths. From here, the story descends into the base of that pyramid, where the lives of countless others were shaped, broken, and offered up in the name of cosmic order.
In the grand architecture of ancient Egyptian society, matters of the heart and sacred ritual were not private affairs. They formed a strict hierarchy, arranged as precisely as the stone blocks of the pyramids. At the very top stood the pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, the bridge between earth and sky. His strength and authority were believed to be the heartbeat of the kingdom. If he faltered, the Nile might cease to flow, the harvest might fail, and the gods might turn their faces away. Below him were the nobles, high priests, and temple functionaries, all bound in a system where their roles blended religious duty with public demonstrations of worthiness before the gods. At the wide base of this human pyramid were those with little or no control over their destinies: slaves, temple servants, and children, especially those of noble birth, pledged to the gods before they could understand what it meant. Behind the solemnity of ritual, their lives became instruments in the maintenance of Mot, the cosmic balance, as defined by those in power. Royal children were a special case. Unlike the offspring of commoners, they embodied dynastic purity and divine lineage. Many were sent to temples before reaching maturity, dedicated to the service of the gods. Outwardly, it was an honor. In truth, it marked the beginning of a life of strict discipline, where every glance, movement, and word was shaped to serve ceremonial purposes. These children were taught that they belonged to a greater mission. Priests trained them in posture, composure, and voice, preparing them to stand for hours in ceremonies. They learned hymns, performed sacred dances, and took part in rites believed to help sustain the balance of the universe. This system was not hidden. It was openly sanctified, legitimized by a theology that bound human ambition and divine will into a single, unbreakable thread. For those at the top, it created the illusion of control, aligning personal honor with the fate of the nation. For those below, it stripped away choice entirely, making them instruments of both gods and men. This was the true shape of Egypt's sacred hierarchy,
a great pyramid where each level supported the one above, and at the pinnacle, the pharaoh stood in the divine light that the entire kingdom was made to create. It began with ceremony, cloaked in the language of honor. A royal decree would be issued, declaring that a son or daughter of the elite had been chosen for the temple. The family would gather in their finest linen, offering prayers of gratitude. Gifts of honey, bread, and flowers would be carried to the priests. To the watching crowd, it was a moment of pride, a child ascending into sacred service. But behind the towering gates of the temple complex, the reality was starkly different. The first days were meant to soften the child's resistance. Priests and attendants would shower them with attention, tell them stories of the gods, and allow them to wander the incense-thick courtyards where lotus ponds glimmered in the sun. They were taught to chant hymns, to bow in the correct posture before the statues, to recite the names of the deities whose favor they were to secure. At first, it must have felt like a grand game. Then came the training. The child's body was measured, assessed, and compared against the temple's silent standards. The trainers, men and women who had once been temple children themselves, knew exactly what was required. Flexibility drills began immediately. Limbs pulled into positions that strained muscles and ligaments, held until tears rolled down their cheeks. The lessons were long, unbroken by rest, the same movements repeated again and again, until pain blurred into numbness. You must become like the papyrus reed, they were told, bending but never breaking. Food was rationed, not because the temple lacked resources, but because a childlike physique was preferred for certain rites. Meals were carefully portioned, sometimes laced with herbs to slow growth or suppress changes brought by adolescence. The temple's logic was cruelly pragmatic. Youthfulness was a form of currency in the sacred economy. Soon, ritual gestures were introduced, touches and caresses taught under the guise of divine blessings. The children were shown carved temple reliefs depicting gods and goddesses in intimate embrace and told to mimic the poses. At first, they copied mechanically, not understanding the full meaning. But the temple masters were patient, reshaping the children's instincts through repetition until the gestures became second nature. The mental conditioning was as calculated as the physical. The children were praised when they endured pain or exhaustion without protest, told they were beloved by the gods for their obedience. Pleasure, discomfort, even fear, all were to be set aside. The body was not theirs. It was a vessel, a sacred tool for cosmic balance, and a tool did not question the hands that wielded it. The medical papyri that survive, those that somehow escaped later destruction, speak in clinical detachment of the damage done. Dislocated joints, pelvic injuries, chronic infections, and internal bleeding. The priests recorded treatments as they would for any other temple asset, but survival was never guaranteed. Many children died before reaching adulthood, their small bodies buried without names in temple grounds, their deaths explained away as returns to the divine. For those who lived, there was no going back. By the time a temple child reached adolescence, the training had stripped them of any concept of personal boundaries. They moved through ceremonies like instruments played by others, their own will buried under layers of ritual conditioning. The system was designed to ensure that they never saw themselves as victims, only as chosen ones, fulfilling a destiny that bound them to the gods for life. And while the temples shaped these children for their own rites, another, more lucrative market for their services was growing beyond the sacred walls, one that merged religious obligation with private wealth in ways that made the suffering profitable.
Beyond the temple walls, the Nile flowed past bustling markets where goods from across the known world changed hands. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt. But there was another trade here, one rarely spoken of in public, yet as entrenched in Egyptian society as any commodity: the buying and selling of human bodies for pleasure, sanctioned by both law and religion. In this market, children, especially those marked as pure or trained, were the most valuable of all. Purity was not defined by innocence, but by a constructed spiritual ideal: youth unspoiled by childbirth, bodies molded by temple discipline, minds taught to submit without hesitation. Such children were considered near perfect in the eyes of Egypt's elite. Wealthy families, nobles, and high-ranking priests maintained private households where these young servants were kept, sometimes for ceremonial duties, other times as symbolic ornaments of status. Their value was measured by age, appearance, and the level of training received. A child who could move with the grace of a temple dancer, sing sacred hymns, and recite ritual phrases while performing tasks considered specialized was worth many times more than one without such preparation. Legal documents from the time leave no doubt about the regulated nature of this trade. Bills of sale noted not only a child's age and health, but their skills and training. Contracts could stipulate exclusive service to one household or permit them to be loaned for festivals. The law not only tolerated this, it managed it for the benefit of the powerful. For the children, the psychological burden was immense. Modern psychology would call it complex trauma. Growing up without personal agency, taught to see themselves as vessels rather than individuals. Some developed patterns of behavior shaped entirely by the system's expectations. Others withdrew completely, avoiding human contact. Ancient writings referred to youths who grew hollow, or hearts that broke from too much service, poetic disguises for lives cut short in spirit long before their time. Religious doctrine elevated the practice. Priests preached that serving the gods in body and spirit was the highest devotion. Children selected for such service were called blessed among mortals. Families eager for royal or temple favor often accepted the choice in silence, bound by tradition and the hope of spiritual merit. Economics deepened the cruelty. The value of a trained temple youth could reach staggering amounts, and for some families, giving a child into service was a way to clear debts or gain influence. Among the wealthy, these children could even be exchanged as gifts to cement alliances. Archaeology confirms the scale. Temple records list expenses for youth preparation alongside festival goods. Burial sites in temple districts reveal remains with injuries consistent with intensive training, physical strain, and untreated illness. In some areas, a high proportion of child burials show signs of ritual exploitation. This was a system so deeply woven into Egypt's social fabric that for centuries it was accepted as part of the divine order. Only in moments of crisis did the facade slip, revealing the suffering beneath. One such moment came during Egypt's most infamous festival, when the kingdom surrendered to chaos in the name of the gods, the Feast of Drunkenness.
If the daily life of ancient Egypt blurred the line between worship and exploitation, then the Feast of Drunkenness obliterated it entirely. What had once been a solemn celebration of divine femininity transformed over centuries into a week-long descent into chaos, an officially sanctioned collapse of order, where the roles of master and slave, noble and commoner, god and mortal dissolved into a single intoxicating tide.
Its roots lay in one of Egypt's most ancient and violent myths, the tale of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of vengeance. The story tells of a time when humanity angered the sun god Ra so greatly that he unleashed Sekhmet to punish them. She descended upon the land in a frenzy of slaughter, her thirst for blood unquenchable. Day after day she killed, until the Nile itself ran red. Only when Ra tricked her, by flooding the fields with beer dyed the color of blood, did her rage relent. Mistaking the drink for her enemy's lifeblood, she consumed so much that she became drunk, her ferocity melting into joy, transforming her into the gentler goddess Hathor. This act of divine intoxication became the model for the Feast of Drunkenness. To drink oneself into ecstasy was not a vice, it was to imitate the gods, to be temporarily possessed by them. And so once a year, temples across Egypt prepared to recreate the moment when destruction turned to pleasure, chaos to celebration. The preparations began months in advance. Temple granaries would set aside vast quantities of barley, brewing beer in monumental vats. But this was not ordinary beer. To ensure visions and a state of divine receptivity, it was often laced with extracts from blue lotus and other plants known for their psychoactive effects. What emerged was a drink that not only intoxicated, but altered the mind entirely, opening it, the priests claimed, to the presence of gods. As the festival approached, the tension in the cities became almost electric. Processions of musicians, dancers, and priests moved through the streets, announcing the coming celebration. Families stocked up on bread, figs, and beer, knowing that for the festival's duration, work would cease. The boundaries of propriety loosened in anticipation. Flirtations became bolder, music louder, laughter more frequent. Then, on the appointed day, the restraints broke entirely. From the great temple of Hathor at Dendera to the smallest village shrine, the same ritual unfolded. Libations poured, songs sung in praise of the goddess, and the first cups of the sacred beer lifted to eager lips. The air filled with the mingled scents of roasted meat, incense, and fermenting drink. But this was only the beginning. In the days to come, the thin fabric of Egyptian social order would tear completely. In theory, the festival was about joy and renewal, about the life-giving power of the goddess. In practice, it became a maelstrom where anything, no matter how brutal, could be sanctified under the banner of divine possession. The priests claimed that during the Feast of Drunkenness, every act was holy because it was the gods acting through mortal bodies. This doctrine would open the gates to the most extreme and unrestrained behavior imaginable, acts that, once the beer and lotus took hold, even the participants might not remember afterward. And so, under the blazing Egyptian sun, with the Nile glimmering beyond the temple walls, the kingdom stood poised at the edge of a ritual frenzy unlike anything in the ancient world. The first cups had been drained, the chants had begun, and within hours, Egypt would belong not to its pharaoh, not to its laws, but to the goddess whose intoxication once saved mankind by nearly destroying it.
Months before the Feast of Drunkenness began, the transformation of Egypt was already in motion. Inside the temple courtyards, master brewers worked in shifts, their arms deep in great vats of fermenting beer. Barley was soaked, mashed, and boiled in enormous copper cauldrons, the air thick with a yeasty, almost sweet scent that clung to the skin. But this was no simple tavern brew. It was potent, deliberately so. The priests oversaw every step, sprinkling dried blue lotus petals and infusions of desert herbs into the mixture. These additives were not for flavor. They were chosen for their mind-altering properties, intended to dissolve inhibitions and open the mind to visions. The beer was poured into great amphorae, sealed with mud stoppers and stored in dark, cool chambers beneath the temples. Each vessel was marked with the sigil of Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and intoxication, as though the drink itself were a sacred relic. By the time the festival drew near, entire storerooms brimmed with this golden-brown liquid, enough to drown a city in ecstasy. Meanwhile, in the villages, people began crafting masks, garlands, and brightly painted fans. Merchants stocked up on fruits and roasted nuts, knowing they would sell them to the roving crowds. Families set aside their finest linens, eager to enter the celebration looking their best, even though they knew those linens might be torn, stained, or lost before the week was done. Priests roamed the streets, proclaiming the approach of the sacred days. Their processions were accompanied by music, the bright clanging of sistrums, the deep thrum of drums, and the haunting melodies of reed flutes. Dancers swayed in time, their bodies already hinting at the sensual chaos to come. It was as though the entire country were taking a deep, collective breath before plunging into water. When the appointed day arrived, the opening rituals began at dawn. At the great temple of Hathor and Dendera, priests in white linen poured the first libations before the goddess's golden statue, chanting hymns that praised her beauty and mercy, and her divine intoxication. Sacred beer was lifted and clay cups toward the sky before the first drink was taken. The people gathered in the temple courtyards, their anticipation visible in restless movements and eager glances. The first sips were tentative, respectful, but as the sun climbed higher, the effect of the brew began to seep through the crowds. The blue lotus infusion worked quickly, loosening limbs, slowing speech, and drawing dreamlike smiles onto faces. By midday, the festival had shed its formality entirely. Groups formed and reformed like schools of fish, pulling strangers into their midst. Music grew louder, rhythms more urgent. The air was rich with the mingled smells of sweat, incense, roasting meat, and ferment. The boundaries between master and servant, noble and commoner dissolved as hands reached freely, laughter turned to shouts, and chants to wild, wordless cries. It was understood by all, without needing to be spoken, that the gods had taken possession. The beer was their breath, the music their voice, the bodies moving in the sun their chosen instruments. And in this belief lay the permission for what would follow, a week in which the restraints of law, status, and even morality would be obliterated in the name of divine ecstasy.
By the second day, the feast no longer resembled a festival. It was a different world entirely. The Nile's banks teemed with revelers, their skin glistening under the sun, their voices rising in unrestrained song. Masters and slaves drank side by side, passing amphorae between them with no thought to rank or propriety. The lines that had held Egyptian society in place for millennia dissolved like papyrus in water. Public spaces became stages for acts that, in ordinary times, would have been unthinkable. In market squares, couples embraced in the open, bodies moving to the pounding rhythm of drums. Noble women shed their jewelry and fine linens, joining roving bands of strangers who swept through the streets, pulling others into their frenzied dance. Even children were not shielded. Small hands clasped cups of sacred beer, eyes wide at the scenes unfolding around them, until, in some cases, they too were drawn into the chaos. Bands of intoxicated celebrants roamed the cities, kicking open doors, dragging reluctant occupants into the streets. Refusal was not tolerated. The priests had declared that, during these days, the gods moved through mortal flesh, and any act, no matter how violent, no matter how intimate, was an offering. To resist was to defy the gods themselves. Competitions broke out among men who sought to prove their endurance and virility before both mortals and deities. The contests were not for sport in the way we would understand them today.
They were grueling, often violent, driven by the belief that sustaining arousal for hours or even days was a mark of divine favor. Participants collapsed in the heat, some never to rise again, their deaths mourned as sacrifices rather than tragedies. Violence became indistinguishable from pleasure. Teeth sank into flesh, nails drew blood, and bruises bloomed like flowers on bare skin. Those who emerged from these encounters bearing wounds were celebrated, their injuries treated as gifts from the gods. In some cases, victims of this ritualized violence died where they lay, too broken to move, their bodies left as offerings in the dust until the priests came to collect them. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with the fever of the celebration. Fires burned in makeshift pits, illuminating figures writhing in shadow. Music never ceased. If a drum broke, hands slapped against clay jars or bare thighs to keep the beat alive. Sleep was rare and fleeting. Anyone who lay down risked being swept into another wave of revelers. And always the beer flowed. Amphorae after amphorae was drained, refilled, and drained again. The blue lotus in its depths kept the mind in a hazy twilight where reality and vision blurred. Many claimed to see the gods walking among them, Sekhmet with her lioness head and blazing eyes, Hathor, radiant with golden skin and endless laughter. In this state, any act, no matter how savage, could be accepted as divine will. By the festival's midpoint, Egypt had become a living paradox, a civilization famed for its order and precision, willingly surrendering itself to chaos so complete that it seemed almost like the end of the world. But for the participants, this was not the end. It was renewal. And in the days that followed, the scale of what took place would reach heights and depths that even the most hardened priest might hesitate to recall aloud.
Word of the Feast of Drunkenness did not remain within Egypt's borders. Foreign envoys, merchants, and emissaries who happened to be present during the festival returned to their homelands with stories so lurid that they seemed like exaggerations, until multiple accounts began to align. Mesopotamian scribes described it as the week when Egypt becomes the mouth of a devouring lion. Diplomats from the Hittite court warned their kings never to send representatives during that season, lest they be pulled into the madness and defiled by strange gods. The scandal was not merely in the intoxication or public coupling, it was in the sanctioned violence. Women, especially those considered beautiful or highborn, were often targeted in group assaults that were treated not as crimes but as sacred communion. Men, too, could find themselves seized, overpowered, and subjected to humiliations in front of cheering crowds. The victims were not pitied. They were praised for having pleased the goddess by surrendering their bodies to her will. Children were among the most vulnerable. Accounts from foreign witnesses speak of them being paraded through the streets, adorned with garlands, and offered sacred beer until their steps faltered. Once intoxicated, they were drawn into acts they could not comprehend, surrounded by onlookers chanting hymns. For outsiders, the sight was abhorrent. For the Egyptians within the festival, it was simply the fulfillment of divine possession. The aftermath was as devastating as the days themselves. Many participants awoke with no memory of what they had done, only bruises, torn clothing, and in some cases injuries so severe that they required weeks of recovery. Families discovered betrayals they could never have imagined, husbands who had lain with strangers, wives who had left their children for days, friends who had turned on one another in drunken aggression. Children born 9 months after the festival carried a particular stigma. They were sometimes called sons of Hathor or daughters of Sekhmet, a title that marked them not as blessed, but as reminders of chaos. Some households quietly abandoned such infants, leaving them at temple gates as offerings. Economically, the feast was a disaster. For 7 days, agriculture, trade, and governance ground to a halt. The state treasury lost revenue as workers abandoned their duties, and grain shipments spoiled on river barges while their crews joined the celebrations. Yet, the pharaohs permitted and even encouraged the festival. It was a calculated gamble. By giving the people one sanctioned period to vent their frustrations and indulge every forbidden impulse, they kept the rest of the year under tighter control. To the priests, the risks were worth it. In their theology, the feast was a reenactment of the moment the world was saved from Sekhmet's rage. By drinking, fighting, and coupling in abandon, the people renewed their covenant with the goddess, offering her chaos so she would spare them her wrath. Archaeological evidence supports the accounts of the festival's extremes. Excavations at temple sites such as Dendera and Karnak have revealed chambers with benches carved into the walls, drainage channels in the floors, and niches that appear to have been designed for holding restraints. These spaces align disturbingly well with written descriptions of the more violent rites. Foreign observers left Egypt convinced that the civilization's grandeur was a facade over a core of barbarism. And yet, for the Egyptians themselves, this was not shameful. It was survival. In their eyes, what outsiders called depravity was a sacred duty, a price paid to keep the cosmic balance. But as Egypt's political fortunes shifted and foreign powers began to exert influence, this dangerous dance between ecstasy and order would be challenged and ultimately altered in ways that shook the foundations of its religion.
Centuries later, long after the last feast of drunkens had faded into memory, the earth began to give up its secrets. Archaeologists peeling back layers of sand at temple sites in Dendera, Karnak, and Edfu uncovered evidence that the festival's most disturbing descriptions had not been exaggerations. What they found was not the grandeur of processional halls or the serenity of shrine rooms, but spaces that reeked of another, darker purpose. Beneath certain temple complexes lay small, windowless chambers carved with unsettling precision. Their stone benches were low and narrow, just wide enough to seat or restrain a person. Grooves cut into the floors sloped toward drainage channels, as if designed to carry away liquids, blood, beer, or both. On the walls, faint traces of pigment outlined figures locked in embraces that were anything but romantic. In some carvings, limbs were bound, and faces were contorted in expressions that mixed pleasure and agony. Such features matched almost perfectly with written accounts from ancient papyri describing the chambers of the goddess, where participants in the feast would be bound in joy and offering. To the modern mind, these spaces look like rooms for ritualized assault. To the ancient priests, they were holy ground where mortal bodies became vessels for divine chaos. Artifacts told the same story. Pottery jars, still crusted with residue of beer laced with blue lotus, were found beside bronze cups dented from heavy use. Fragments of jewelry, cheap copper anklets alongside gold armlets, hinted at a mingling of rich and poor within these chambers, stripped of rank once the rites began. Most telling were the human remains. In some temple precincts, shallow graves held skeletons showing signs of violent injury, broken ribs, fractured skulls, and dislocated joints. Some of the dead were adults, but many were adolescents and children. Forensic analysis revealed patterns consistent with blunt force, twisting restraints, and injuries to the pelvis. Whether they died during the festival or from untreated wounds in its aftermath, their fates were sealed in the same ritual context. The physical evidence left no doubt. The feast was not merely a drunken gathering, but a deliberate, structured collapse into sanctioned chaos. The architecture, the tools, and the remains all pointed to a carefully maintained tradition, where violence and ecstasy were two sides of the same sacred coin. By the time the Ptolemies, Greece's Macedonian rulers, took control of Egypt in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest, these rites were still alive, though already drawing the scrutiny of foreign eyes. The Greek elite, steeped in their own traditions of order and rationality, found the Egyptian celebrations both mesmerizing and repellent.
When Cleopatra I ascended to power as co-regent with her young son Ptolemy VI, she inherited not only a throne, but a fractured kingdom.
and Egypt caught between its own ancient traditions and the expectations of its Greek rulers. By then, the Feast of Drunkenness had already been tempered in certain cities under Ptolemaic influence, but in the heartlands, at Dendera, Thebes, and smaller temple towns, it raged on with much of its former abandon. Cleopatra, raised in a Hellenistic court but politically astute enough to respect the old ways, faced a perilous question. How could she preserve stability without alienating the priesthood that legitimized her reign? Her solution was cautious yet bold. She decreed that the feast would be shortened from 7 days to 3, limiting the official supply of the potent Blue Lotus beer after the first day. Public coupling in open squares was prohibited by royal edict, and certain dangerous ritual chambers within temples were to be sealed for the duration of the festival. On the surface, it appeared a compromise, still honoring the goddess Hathor and the ancient myth of Sekhmet's intoxication while curbing the worst excesses. But for Egypt's traditional priesthood, these measures were nothing less than sacrilege. To them, the feast was not a negotiable custom, it was a cosmic necessity. In their eyes, to deny Hathor her full measure of chaos was to invite Sekhmet's return in wrath. They warned Cleopatra that the gods would punish the land, the Nile would fail to flood, famine would follow, and foreign armies would breach Egypt's borders. Within months of the reforms, natural misfortunes began to unfold. A poor Nile inundation, locust swarms in Upper Egypt, and a minor military defeat against a border incursion. The priests seized on these events as proof that divine anger was already at work. Whispers spread in the marketplaces and village squares. The queen had angered the gods, and Egypt would pay the price. Cleopatra found herself trapped between two empires, one spiritual, one political. To the Greeks in her court, her restrictions did not go far enough. To the Egyptians in the temples, they were an unforgivable violation. And looming on the horizon was Rome, a superpower whose senators already viewed Egyptian religious customs as decadent, even dangerous. Her successor, Cleopatra III, would face an even sharper edge of this blade. The Roman alliance that had once seemed like a bulwark against foreign threats became another source of scrutiny and judgment. Roman envoys invited to observe Egypt's sacred festivals left scandalized, writing home of shameless rites and debauched priests. Some openly compared Egypt to the most decadent days of fallen Carthage. In this tense climate, the feasts became increasingly compartmentalized. Public celebrations were modestly staged for foreign eyes, while the traditional rites, complete with their chaos and violence, were driven underground, held in sealed temple chambers where Roman officials were not permitted. This secrecy only intensified the abuse within. Without public oversight, the rituals devolved further into extremes, with fewer witnesses willing or able to intervene. The priesthood, clinging desperately to traditions that had defined Egypt for 3 millennia, saw in these hidden rites both resistance and survival. For the royal court, the duplicity was a dangerous gamble. One wrong word to the wrong Roman ear could bring not just political scandal, but military reprisal. Egypt stood in a brittle balance, its outward face a polished mask of civility for the Mediterranean world, its inner life a boiling undercurrent of ritual chaos, secrecy, and fear. But as the shadow of Rome grew longer over the Nile, that balance was doomed to collapse. The last feast of drunkenness in its true form would be drowned not in beer, but in conquest.
When Octavian, soon to be Augustus Caesar, marched into Egypt in 30 BCE after the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, he came not as a curious visitor, but as a conqueror with a mandate to strip the land of its independence. Egypt's wealth, its grain, gold, and monumental stoneworks was obvious to claim, but the Romans' deeper conquest lay in reshaping the pulse of its spiritual life. Roman officers and chroniclers recorded their shock at what they found within certain temple precincts. Behind gilded doors and beneath towering pylons, they encountered carvings and relics that told stories in a language of symbols. Entwined figures, spirals of lotus and vine, and scenes of unrestrained revelry. The air in some chambers still carried the faint scent of drink and incense, as though the echoes of celebration had yet to fade. Augustus himself, according to later Roman accounts, was unsettled. To a Roman statesman, religion was the steel frame of civic discipline, not a license for the walls to collapse. The Feast of Drunkenness, with its topsy-turvy order and dissolving of boundaries, seemed not like a quaint local custom, but a threat to imperial control. It turned the Roman moral code inside out, replacing discipline with abandon, rank with equality. The Roman answer was swift. Public festivals honoring Hathor and Sekhmet were abolished. Temple treasuries were seized, and amphora of blue lotus brew were spilled into the sand. Soldiers took chisels to walls, softening the once bold imagery until it was only a shadow of its former self. Scrolls detailing ritual preparations were consigned to flame, their ashes scattered into the Nile. Priests who resisted vanished from the record. Those who complied found themselves in sanctuaries stripped of their old influence. Yet the purge was more than destruction. It was an erasure. Roman builders refitted sacred chambers into storerooms and offices. Statues of Hathor with her sistrum were replaced by Roman forms or left as silent stone, their altars bare. Spaces designed for gathering and unity, benches, channels, hidden alcoves, were dismantled or sealed away beneath new floors. For the young people who had known no life outside these temples, the change was like being cast from the center of a vast constellation into a sky without stars. Trained only for ceremonial roles, they drifted through Thebes, Memphis, and Alexandria, unsure where to belong. Some were drawn into shadowed corners of the city's commerce. Others, Roman records hint, chose to step away from life entirely. Those who endured carried invisible scars. For generations, their value had been measured through sacred service, service now declared shameful. With the rites gone, identities unraveled, and communities once bound by festival rhythms dissolved. A few clung to the old ways in secret, meeting in hushed rooms to pass down fragments of the songs and dances, their ceremonies reduced to whispers. But secrecy could not hold back the tide. Under Roman rule, Egypt's sacred calendar was rewritten, its deities absorbed into the imperial pantheon, and its wildest celebrations quieted. The Feast of Drunkenness, once a yearly unbinding of the social order in the name of cosmic balance, became little more than a fading story. The Romans had done more than seize Egypt's treasures. They had severed a living thread of its soul, a dangerous, intoxicating, profoundly human tradition that had been both the kingdom's release and its shadow.
The Romans believed they had stamped out the old rites, but like embers buried under ash, the cults still glowed in secret. In the alleyways of Thebes, in the reed villages along the Nile's quieter bends, and in the dim back rooms of Alexandria's poorer districts, whispers of Hathor and Sekhmet's feasts persisted. These were no longer grand spectacles with temple processions and open-air chaos. They had become shadows of their former selves, practiced in secrecy, away from Roman eyes. The surviving priests, stripped of official titles, adapted. They told the old myths in fragments, passing them to a select few initiates under the guise of harmless storytelling. Ritual beer was brewed in small batches, concealed among ordinary amphorae of household drink. The intoxicating blue lotus was harder to come by under Roman oversight, but the cults found ways to trade for it, hiding it in spice shipments or among bundles of dried herbs. The rites themselves grew even darker in this secrecy. Without the public aspect to temper them, what had once been collective chaos became something more concentrated and predatory. Victims, often children purchased through underground networks, were prepared in hidden chambers, their presence explained as domestic service to outsiders.
Freed from any possibility of public scrutiny, some priests pushed the acts further than the ancient festival ever had, justifying the escalation as a desperate effort to keep the goddess's favor alive in a hostile age. Roman administrators were not entirely ignorant of these undercurrents. Reports from provincial governors mention illegal gatherings and Egyptian orgies, though the language is vague, perhaps deliberately so. The empire's focus was on maintaining grain production and tax collection. So long as the cults did not spark rebellion or threaten commerce, they were often left to smolder. But sometimes the embers flared too brightly. In one recorded case from Upper Egypt, a gathering in honor of Hathor spiraled into a violent frenzy that left several dead. The Romans responded by arresting the suspected priests and crucifying them at the city gates as a warning. Yet even this failed to quench the belief that the gods still demanded their due. The trafficking of children became a lifeline for these underground cults. Roman records from Alexandria and Memphis detailed intercepted caravans in which children, some no more than 7 years old, were found hidden among trade goods bound for religious households. The descriptions align disturbingly with the old temple system, suggesting that what had once been state-sanctioned had now become black market commerce with even higher risk and profit. For the wider Egyptian population, the survival of these rites created a kind of cultural ghost. They were rarely seen directly, yet their presence lingered in rumors, in cautionary tales told to frighten children, and in the occasional, unexplained disappearance during certain seasons. To some, these cults were a dangerous relic of a corrupt past. To others, they were the last fragile link to an identity the Romans tried to erase. And so, beneath the order and discipline of the Pax Romana, Egypt's most transgressive tradition lived on, not in the sunlit courtyards of its temples, but in the shadows where the old gods still listened, and where the echoes of the feast could still be heard in the clink of hidden cups.
By the 2nd century CE, the underground rites had begun to lose their sharpness. The old priestly bloodlines were thinning, their knowledge fractured by generations of secrecy and fear. What had once been an elaborate, multi-day sequence of myth reenactments, intoxication, and ritual violence had decayed into fragments. A song half-remembered, a gesture repeated without understanding, a cup of bitter beer passed hand to hand. The Blue Lotus, once the intoxicating heart of the festival, had nearly vanished from the Nile. Roman trade controls and agricultural reforms favored grain exports over native flora, and the plant became rare enough to be known mostly from faded temple carvings. Without it, the trance-like states the priests once induced became harder to achieve, and so the rites shifted toward heavier alcohol and cruder stimulants. The results were often less mystical and more simply destructive. Still, stories endured. In small farming villages, elders told children of a time when the goddess Hathor walked among mortals, smiling as they danced in fields of golden light. In these softened retellings, the chaos and bloodshed were stripped away, replaced by images of music, wine, and joy. The darker truths of the feast, its sanctioned cruelty and human sacrifice, were pushed into the shadows, surviving only in whispered warnings. Don't wander after sundown during Hathor's week. The old priests still take what they're owed. By the 3rd century CE, much of Egypt's native religion had been absorbed or displaced by the growing presence of Christianity. The new faith's leaders denounced the old festivals as demonic orgies, further eroding their legitimacy. Converts were told to destroy any idols of Hathor, Sekhmet, or Isis still kept in their homes, and to replace them with crosses. In some towns, former temple spaces were converted into churches, the reliefs of dancing and drinking gods plastered over or scraped away. Ironically, this suppression may have preserved parts of the old myth in hidden form. In remote Coptic Christian communities, certain feast days bore curious similarities to the old celebrations: seasonal gatherings with music,
veiled women dancing, and the sharing of sweet, potent drinks. The official story tied these customs to saints' days, but the rhythms of the events echoed a much older calendar. By the late Roman period, the Feast of Drunkenness, as it had been in pharaonic times, was gone. What remained was a ghost, half ritual, half rumor, passed down in folk tales and night whispers. A child disappearing during the harvest might be blamed on Hathor's taking. A sudden storm after a village festival could be interpreted as Sekhmet's displeasure. For most, these were just stories. But for a small few, those whose families still guarded scraps of the old rites, they were reminders that the gods were not dead, only waiting. And perhaps, in the right season, with the right offering, the gates between mortal order and divine chaos could open again.
By the early 5th century CE, Egypt stood at the edge of another transformation. Christianity was no longer just a growing faith, it was the state religion of the Eastern Roman Empire. Pagan temples, already in decline, were being systematically closed by imperial decree. Statues of the old gods were defaced, temple treasuries confiscated, and any priest caught performing sacrifices was charged with blasphemy. In this climate, the last true echo of the Feast of Drunkenness unfolded, not as a grand festival, but as a desperate act of preservation. In a remote village on the west bank of the Nile, a small circle of elderly priests, their apprentices, and a handful of devoted families gathered under the pretense of a harvest celebration. They carried with them the last known cache of preserved blue lotus flowers, dried and stored for decades in clay jars hidden beneath a crumbling shrine. The night began quietly. The participants drank, sang old hymns, and told the story of Hathor's descent to earth, the goddess who once saved humanity by turning Sekhmet's wrath into joy. But as the drink deepened and the lotus smoke curled into the air, the rite began to slip into its older, more dangerous form. Boundaries loosened. Ancient chants, forbidden for over a century, were spoken aloud. At the center of the circle, the youngest initiate, a boy no older than 12, was crowned with a wreath of papyrus and anointed as the child of Hathor, his role both symbolic and sacrificial. What happened next survives only in fragments, some from hostile Christian chroniclers, others from whispered family histories. In the Christian version, the gathering descended into demonic frenzy, with ritual coupling, drunken violence, and the killing of the boy as an offering to the goddess. In the oral tradition of the villagers, the boy was taken by Hathor. Whether that meant death, spiritual transformation, or something more mysterious, was never made clear. What is certain is that the rite did not remain secret for long. A traveling monk, passing through the village, witnessed enough to alert the local bishop. Within days, imperial soldiers arrived. The remaining priests were arrested. Most were executed publicly in Alexandria. The temple ruins were leveled, and the ground was consecrated to Saint Theodora. The surviving villagers scattered, and the blue lotus vanished entirely from cultivation in Egypt. That night came to be known among the few who remembered it as the last rite of Hathor. It marked the end of an unbroken tradition that had stretched back more than 3,000 years. A tradition born in the mythic dawn of Egypt, carried through the reigns of pharaohs, tested under foreign dynasties, corrupted in secrecy, and finally snuffed out under the shadow of the cross. From then on, the Feast of Drunkenness belonged only to memory and to the stones. In the carvings of Dendera's great temple, Hathor still smiles, her sistrum raised, her eyes half closed in eternal intoxication. Tourists would one day gaze up at her and see only art, but in the silence of the stone, the old song still lingered, waiting for ears that could hear.
Centuries passed. Sand swallowed ruins, papyrus rotted to dust, and the details of the Feast of Drunkenness blurred into mythology. By the time Napoleon's scholars arrived in Egypt in the late 18th century, the old temples were sun-baked skeletons. Dendera's great temple still stood, its walls carved with images of musicians, dancers, and feasts, but the meaning behind them was largely lost. It was only in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Egyptology emerged as a serious discipline, that fragments of the truth began to re-emerge. Archaeologists studying inscriptions at Dendera, Edfu, and Thebes found repeated references to a night of the drunkenness and to a goddess who saves mankind through joy. Early interpretations were romantic. Victorian scholars described it as a harvest festival or a primitive form of Mardi Gras, conveniently ignoring the darker ritual elements. That selective reading persisted for decades. Museum displays spoke of Hathor's celebrations of music and wine, without mentioning the violence, the sexual rites, or the human sacrifices. In part, this was scholarly caution. No one wanted to build grand theories from incomplete evidence, but it was also cultural sanitation. The idea that one of the most refined civilizations of antiquity had institutionalized ritual chaos and bloodshed was too jarring for many to accept. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the translation of more temple inscriptions and a deeper analysis of skeletal remains from ceremonial pits, that the darker contours became undeniable. Forensic studies revealed trauma on bones consistent with ritual killing. Chemical analysis detected residues of blue lotus alkaloids in pottery shards from temple breweries. The image of the feast shifted again, from quaint celebration to something far more complex and far more unsettling. Still, much remains unknown. How exactly were the victims chosen? Did all regions practice the same rites, or did the intensity vary? And most tantalizing of all, did the underground cults truly vanish? Or did fragments of their practices seep into other traditions, hidden in plain sight? In modern Egypt, a handful of folklorists have noted curious parallels between ancient descriptions of the feast and certain rural customs. In some villages, weddings or harvest feasts still feature a moment where the bride is symbolically hidden or taken, echoing the abduction motifs from Hathor's rites. In others, a cup of heavily spiced beer is passed around at night while a song in a nearly forgotten dialect is sung. No one agrees on its meaning, but the melody, when slowed and compared, bears an uncanny resemblance to musical notations found carved in Dendera. Today, the Feast of Drunkenness occupies an uneasy place between archaeology, anthropology, and legend. To most, it is a footnote, a curious name in a list of ancient festivals. To a few, it is a reminder of something older and wilder than history books are willing to admit, that beneath the ordered facades of every civilization lies a primal hunger for chaos, release, and the dangerous illusion of being chosen by the gods. And perhaps in some locked room, down some forgotten alley in Cairo or Luxor, there are still those who believe that one night of madness each year could keep the world from burning.